Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, salam sejahtera kepada teman-teman PERSEPI yang sudah hadir. Berbahagia sekali kita hari ini kedatangan tamu spesial, Profesor Slater dari University of Michigan, dan juga ada Mas Philip sebagai Ketua PERSEPI yang hari ini kita akan mengadakan diskusi terbatas membahas soal Authoritarian Turn in Southeast Asia ya, jadi arus balik otoritarianisme di Asia Tenggara. Tadi ada pesan dari Bu Aci sebagai mungkin kita bisa bilang sekjen PERSEPI supaya sekjennya Mas J. Oke. Sorry. Tadi ada pesan dari Bu Aci untuk memperkenalkan, kan kita udah 2 tahun ya COVID, jadi baru kali ini lagi kita secara offline bisa bertemu antara teman-teman PERSEPI. Jadi untuk mencairkan suasana, mungkin ada yang belum saling kenal, mungkin bisa memperkenalkan diri dulu, baik dari anggota PERSEPI maupun undangan yang sudah datang hari ini. Silakan, mungkin dimulai dari sini.
Selamat siang semuanya, nama saya Quinten Tembi, saya dosen kebijakan publik di Monash, Universitas Monash Indonesia, kampus baru dan kampus pertama internasional atau asing di Indonesia. Terima kasih banyak.
Terima kasih, saya Jayadi Hanan, Sekjen PERSEPI, sampai Philip memberhentikan saya. Tadi Mbak Aci bukan Sekjen, kan?
Ketua de facto kepala rumah tangga.
Bendahara umum PERSEPI dari zaman dulu sampai sekarang. Ya, demikian.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Perkenalkan, nama saya Pangi Sarwijanago, biasa dipanggil Ipang dari Direktur Eksekutif Foxpol Center. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, nama saya Hoirul Umam, saya dari Universitas Paramadina, karena sekarang Mas Jayadi sudah dibajak oleh Mas Philip, jadi saya mewakili Universitas Paramadina. Saya dulu juga bagian dari keluarga besar anak buahnya Mas Burhan di sini. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih ya Mas. Ya, selamat siang, terima kasih banyak. Nama saya Devi, saya dari Pusat Riset Politik BRIN, dulunya LIPI. Saya kemudian mewakili dari tim pemilu ya Mas untuk hadir di sini. Terima kasih banyak untuk undangannya. Terima kasih.
Ya, selamat siang teman-teman PERSEPI. Saya Belsazar Arya dari Departemen Politik dan Perubahan Sosial CSAS. Tidak keliru dengan Arya Fernandes alias kepala departemennya yang sekarang mungkin sudah join melalui online. Saya di sini setor muka secara offline sebagai staf beliau. Juga Mas Okta di sebelah saya.
Halo, selamat siang semuanya. Nama saya Nori Oktariza, saya juga peneliti di Departemen Politik dan Perubahan Sosial di CSIS.
Halo, selamat siang semuanya. Perkenalkan, nama saya Henry Aribowo, saya wakili Indekstat. Saya di Indekstat sebagai peneliti. Mungkin itu aja perkenalannya. Terima kasih.
Selamat siang, saya masih temannya Mas Hendry, nama saya Fulah Jumainah, perwakilan dari peneliti dari Indekstat juga. Terima kasih.
Selamat siang semuanya, saya Mutakin dari LSI Lembaga Survei Indonesia.
Saya Dahlan dari Indikator. Terima kasih.
Tes. Saya Burhanuddin Muhtadi dari Indikator dan FISIP UIN Sarif Hidayatullah Jakarta.
Baik, terima kasih semuanya anggota PERSEPI yang sudah memperkenalkan diri satu persatu. Oke, untuk mempersingkat waktu, sebelumnya saya perkenalkan diri saya Kennedy Muslim, saya salah satu penelitinya Mas Burhan di Indikator Politik Indonesia. Baik, untuk mempersingkat waktu, kita persilakan Mas Philip mungkin sebagai moderator acara diskusi siang hari ini. Nanti diskusinya akan berlangsung dalam bahasa Inggris. Tadi saya sudah berkomunikasi dengan Profesor Den, tapi Profesor Den akan membuka kesempatan apabila peserta ingin bertanya dalam bahasa Indonesia, dia juga sedikit paham katanya dan akan menjawab dalam bahasa Inggris nanti. Baik, kira-kira begitu. Silakan Mas Philip membuka acara diskusi kita.
Ya, terima kasih Mas Kennedy. Di sini ada Kennedy, ada Philip, ada Bells. Kita semua orang Barat. Kennedy Muslim. Ada Kennedy yang nggak Muslim. Orang Padang, West Sumatera. Selamat siang teman-teman semua yang ikut di ruangan ini. Yang ikut diskusi baik dari YouTube maupun dari di ruangan ini, saya ucapkan terima kasih atas kehadirannya. Ini acara PERSEPI, kami mulai berani lagi membuat acara offline, in person. Dan terutama karena kita kedatangan tamu istimewa, dan Slater, yang tulisan-tulisannya sudah banyak sekali dari University of Michigan, dan dia akan bicara mengenai tren authoritarianism di Asia Tenggara, with question mark or not. Dan nanti kita akan mendengarkan apa yang akan disampaikan oleh Profesor dan Slater. Will be followed by Q&A setelahnya. Saya tidak akan berpanjang-panjang menjelaskan. Saya persilakan Dan untuk menyampaikan pandangan-pandangnya. Please, floor is yours.
Oke, selamat siang semuanya. Assalamualaikum. Saya minta maaf karena guna bahasa Inggris, tapi seperti bilang oleh Pak Kennedy, kalau mau tanya pertanyaan bahasa Indonesia, pasti boleh juga, terserah. So slides, you can just begin. Okay. So what I want to do today, to begin, I'd like to say a few words about what I've come to Indonesia this week to think about and write about. I'll be writing a new article for Journal of Democracy soon with this title, The Global Importance of Democratic Indonesia. And so let me say a few words on that before we talk about broader trends, because I think it's important to think about Indonesia within those trends and put these all together. So what I argue in the piece that I'm writing is that Indonesia today is maybe the most important democracy in the world, both to understand and also to defend. Indonesia is experiencing democratic regression, like so much of the world. But I think that we have to keep in mind that in Indonesia, it's such an important place not only for who Indonesian democracy represents, but also what Indonesian democracy represents. And I don't argue that Indonesia is a model. I don't think any country is a model, but I do think Indonesia is an example. I think it's a very important example, and let me say a few words about that. Indonesia, I think, is an example that democracy, even in a time of increasing authoritarianism, that Indonesia shows that democracy is possible in large countries, Muslim countries, Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, middle-income countries, also possible in a country that is not simply a client of the United States. As the United States is pushing again for a democracy agenda around the world, talking about a democratic camp and an authoritarian camp, things becoming very US versus China. Indonesia is a great example, again, that you can be a democracy because on your own energy, through your own efforts, for your own reasons, you can be a democracy. It doesn't require becoming part of a global camp or becoming pro-American or the like. So I think it's a very important example in these ways. It's also an important example in the sense that Indonesia has shown that you can have democratization and then still have economic growth. You can still have social stability. You can have improved relations between ethnic and religious groups rather than worsened relations between ethnic and religious groups. Because one of the main reasons why dictators around the world say we can't have democracy is they say, well, democracy will lead to all of these bad things. And I think Indonesia, again, it's not that it's a model, but it is an example. It's an example that democracy can go along with, pretty good performance economically, right? Again, pretty good social stability. Obviously, a lot of times democracies become unstable, but that's true of authoritarian regimes too. So I think in all of these ways, for democratic actors around the world, for democratic activists around the world, Indonesia is an important example. And in one more way, I have a book that's coming out next month called From Development to Democracy. And in it we talk about how Indonesia is one example of a path to democracy we call authoritarian-led democratization. And this is something that Donald Horowitz in his book called an inside job in Indonesia. That democracy in Indonesia came about in part because the old elites from the Suharto era realized democracy wouldn't harm them too much. Okay? They weren't all thrown out. They weren't all toppled and overthrown. And yet a real democracy emerged for all of its struggles. And I think that this sort of path, this authoritarian-led democratization, is probably the most plausible way, the most likely way that democracy comes about in the world now. And so in that way, for Indonesia to be a success of that, right, and to be an example of how authoritarian elites can accept democratization, they can realize that it won't be the end of the world for them. It won't mean instability. It won't mean the end of economic development. That it's very, very important that we understand the history and how Indonesia has reached its point, that we understand the threats that Indonesian democracy faces, which are very, very real and very, very serious, and that we all think about how best to try to defend Indonesian democracy while we also try to defend American democracy and democracy in so many places around the world where it is in danger. So that's sort of my way to kind of open the comments. And so I'll be writing about that, and I'm very curious for your, if people have reactions and responses to that. But I promised Phillips and Burhan and Kennedy that I would talk a bit more about where Indonesia fits in the world and some of these broader trends. So as I said at the beginning, so Indonesia is, it's a very large country, Muslim country, Southeast Asian country. So let's look at how Indonesia fares compared to other countries that meet those categories. So let's start with some of the biggest countries in the world. And so these data here are from the Varieties of Democracy project, also known as the VDEM project, which has been collecting historical data. It's based in Sweden. So it's a very big global team of researchers who've been collecting data. And so what we're going to look at here are how Indonesia ranks compared to, I don't mean ranks like it's persaingan, right? But just how Indonesia is faring on its electoral democracy index, okay? Which is a little bit less demanding than its liberal democracy index, but it's pretty similar, what you would see. And so what we see here, so Indonesia in this graph is the purple line. It'll be the red line in the next graphs, which is more sesuai dengan bulan Agustus and national independence. But so what we see here is if you go back to the beginning, if we go back to 1990 on the far left, you see, Indonesia, of course, was, it was closer to China, right? Very, very far away from, say, from India, from Brazil, and even Russia. As of the 1990s, it seemed as if Russia had stronger democratic prospects than Indonesia. And so what we'll see the same that same curve for Indonesia throughout all of these slides that I'm going to show. But obviously, China has remained politically stable as it is. But what we've seen is that Brazil and India up at the top have both really been suffering lately. India, the kind of somewhat greenish line you see particularly under Narendra Modi, increased polarization, increased abuse of power. Again, elections have remained largely democratic and free and fair, but this will be a theme I'm going to return to, which is that it's possible, and in fact very common in the world today, that a democracy still maintains its democratic elections, but the governments that win power through democratic elections use its power to deny people rights and to roll back democracy in other ways. So we can see India, people would not have thought, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that India would have fallen behind Indonesia in its sort of overall quality of democracy. We see Brazil, which was really treated and thought of as a kind of role model for a kind of inclusive democracy with good social welfare under the Labour Party until very recently. And there too we've seen real polarization, populism, strongman leader be elected in Bolsonaro. And so you can see the kind of drop off in Brazil according to these, these scores aren't a perfect reflection of reality, but I think they capture something that's broadly true. And so we see in Brazil this real drop off in quality as well. and then Russia, of course, under Vladimir Putin. And so the idea here is that, again, as people around the world look to examples, is democracy possible? Has democracy run its course and is no longer, a viable, form of government, or no longer the most successful form of government in the world? When you look at the world's largest countries, it looks pretty bad. And I didn't put the United States on this chart, but the reason I didn't put the United States on this chart is that VDEM data, I think, totally fails to capture just how bad things have gotten in the United States, and just how much risk. So it would look like a much happier story in the United States if I showed you the VDEM score. I think it tells you something about, I think they're doing a remarkable job of making these things comparable, but there's something about the VDEM methodology that misses something when it fails to appreciate just how much danger and how much damage has been done to American democracy in the past decade or so. So again, among the large countries in the world, which are likely to be some kind of examples for other countries, Indonesia is faring relatively well. When we look only in Indonesia, right, it's easy to emphasize the negative, right? It's easy to focus entirely on the problems, which it's appropriate. It's our job in a democracy to be critical. It's our job not to always praise the government or say, look how wonderfully the government is doing. It's our job to be critical. But it's important to keep in mind here that, looked on its own, we see Indonesia struggling, but looked at in terms of the whole world, large countries, Muslim countries, we'll see Southeast Asian countries, that the picture is a bit more encouraging. So if we think about, the phrase people say all the time, Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim country, it's the world's largest Muslim democracy, right? And so let's think about to what degree Indonesia is still an example, or has been an example in the Muslim world for democracy. And so again here, this is, here now Indonesia is in red, appropriately so. And we see here that again, as of the 1990s, it looks like Egypt, under Mubarak, during the Suharto regime. Obviously the major upswing with the Reformasi, and we see the slight downtick. I don't know how many of you have been following the news from Tunisia, but we see here, this is the purple line here, which after the Arab Spring, of course, Tunisia was the first country to have a democratic breakthrough there, and that's reflected in this skyrocketing purple line, but now you see it sort of falling off of a cliff. And this is only going to get a lot worse. The referendum in Tunisia recently has basically, for all intents and purposes, reinstalled one-person rule in Tunisia. So we're going to see Tunisia look a lot more like the scores of Egypt, and the like, and not as much like Indonesia pretty soon here. So Indonesia will sort of stand more apart, despite the struggles it's had. Turkey here, I think, is maybe the most interesting case to think about. At the early, as of the 1990s, really at the moment that Indonesia democratized, Turkey sort of stood out as a very kind of robust Muslim democracy. And under the leadership of the AKP and under Erdogan, of course, there's been just a very gradual erosion, a very serious decay in Turkish democracy as well. And it has a lot of parallels with the Russia story as well. What we see is sort of strongman rule. We see the deploying of a majoritarian religious nationalism that is used to kind of discredit opposition as not real representatives of the religious minority that is treated as the true nation, the true people. And we're going to see this pattern again and again. We see it in the United States, we see it in Hungary, we see it in India. So this is going to be, I think, a theme that we'll return to, and it's important to think about Indonesia in that context and how the status of minorities fits within Indonesian democracy as well. So again, we look at some of these examples here. Palestine. For a while there, it looked like could be really establishing democracy in Palestine. That too has really kind of fallen by the wayside. So again, we think about the whole world when we think about where Indonesia fits. So again, this is not to say a model. It's not saying it's a role model. It's not to say that Indonesia provides it shows an example of democratic perfection, but it does, I think, show an example of democratic possibility. Okay, so let's now switch to the topic today, Southeast Asia, and talk more at length about where Indonesia fits within here. This is bit more of an active graph, lots of action going on here. So again, Indonesia in red, you can see how it has sort of kind of been holding on to these scores. And again, these are an index that includes things. It includes elections. It includes things like how free is the press, how protected is civil society, these kinds of, how much does the chief executive accept constraints on, on presidential power, these kinds of things. So it's an index of many different features. And so I think some of the things we see here are, so again, Indonesia is in its same position here, but then we can kind of see that obviously Burma, Myanmar, is the kind of most dramatic example of, again, 5 years ago, it wasn't obvious that things were going to go, in such a bad direction, but is, deeply worrisome. And I think for Myanmar, the lesson here, as we think about Indonesia, is I think it really shows the dangers of what happens when a military plays such a prominent political role, and when the military is relied upon by civilian politicians to play a major role in governance, even during moments when there are competitive elections, even in moments when a civilian government is formed. And so this, I think, represents kind of a permanent challenge, for Indonesia, a permanent, threat to democratic stability and survival, the role of the military. And so if you think about Thailand, it's a similar story. And I think in both Thailand and Myanmar, these are cases where, the military has not come back into power because it was needed, right? It has not come back into power because there was some crisis of social stability and only the military can solve this problem. In both Thailand and Myanmar, the military is the problem, especially in Myanmar. The military is the problem. The military is the source of instability. And I think what that shows us is that it's not only when there's an economic crisis, it's not only when things are going wrong with democracy that a powerful military, a historically powerful military, will seize its opportunity to grab national power and to take over. And so I think that we can be hopeful, and I think be optimistic in many ways, that in Indonesia, as long as there's relative political stability, the political parties that win are not opposed to the military, they don't pursue policies that frighten the military, that we can be somewhat confident that the military will not want to intervene too heavily in politics. But I think that Thailand and Myanmar both show that we can't be too confident, that this presents a permanent worry that we should be thinking about. And as civilian politicians and political parties in Indonesia think about the role of the military, they should be keeping this in mind. And the lessons of Thailand and Myanmar are very, I think, very concerning. But I do think that one, and this is again a point that's prominent in the book that Joseph Wong and I have just written, is that one reason why Indonesia has not suffered the kind of drop-off of Thailand or Myanmar, why the military has not taken over power again, is because, maybe ironically, during the New Order, there was the development of a very strong political party, civilian political party, Golkar. And there's no equivalent to Golkar under military rule in Thailand or in Myanmar. So when Thailand and Myanmar began having competitive elections, those elections were won by political parties that were not close to the military. In the case of Myanmar, of course, the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi, very, very strained historical relations with the military. In Thailand, you had Thai Rak Thai under Thaksin Shinawatra, which also came into conflict with the military. And so the fact that in Indonesia the military has not felt the need to seize power like in Thailand or Myanmar is a long historical story. And this is why, again, I think it's important to take a historical look and understand how we got to where we are in Indonesia today. Malaysia, I think, is a more complicated story. It's, I think, a very inspiring story in many ways of a very, very patient civil society that was willing to keep competing in elections, keep mobilizing peacefully, despite the fact that the electoral system was totally rigged against them. This is a deeply electoral authoritarian regime, first under Mahathir Mohamad and then under his successors from the ruling National Front, the Barisan Nasional. And so it took a long time, but finally they were able to break through, and the opposition was able to win. But unfortunately, they did so through a, what people in political science we call a negative coalition. Okay? That basically the groups that came together to defeat the authoritarian government in Malaysia had really nothing in common except the fact that they wanted to defeat the government that was in power, the government of Najib Razak in particular. And in so doing, they made deals and brought actors in who had, to say they had no interest in Malaysian democratization would put it mildly. So they felt the need to bring Mahathir Mohamad back from retirement to help them win. And this was sort of the original sin, if you will, of Malaysian democratization. And so the government fell apart. And we've basically returned to a situation where the old guard is back in power, real lack of democratic commitment, and even it's actually a much less pluralist place right now, Malaysia is, than it was even before democratization, because now the government in Malaysia is basically entirely run by one ethnic group, the majority ethnic group. And so, which creates real dangers for instability looking forward as well. So again, democracy scores don't give you the full picture here, but Malaysia is certainly trending in quite a worrisome direction. And then just talk a bit about the Philippines. The Philippines, of course, has always been known as sort of the oldest democracy in Southeast Asia. It began having competitive elections when under American colonialism. Its experience with martial law under Ferdinand Marcos was relatively brief compared to other countries in Southeast Asia during the Cold War. The Philippines was the land of the people power movement, that was able to, kind of inspired so many democratic revolutions around the world. But we've seen real declines in democratic quality in the Philippines in recent years as well. And again, I think some of these same themes are at play. What we've seen is, under Rodrigo Duterte, what we saw was, again, a strongman leader, someone who was able to win elections freely and fairly, but after winning elections, basically saying, I will do what I want to do. And if you get in my way, you will be crushed. And ironically, this is something that increasingly we see, elections don't prevent this. What elections often do, even democratic elections, will empower people to these leaders to feel they have superpower, because now I am elected, I have the legitimacy, I am the people, I am the nation, and therefore anyone who gets in my way is a traitor. Anyone who gets in my way has to be, that opposition cannot be tolerated. And so under Duterte, he was able to, kind of develop deals with the entire political elite, so there was very, very little political opposition to him. And what we've seen there, and in some ways reflecting some of the patterns we see in Indonesia, we see a very kind of collusive arrangement in which elites have come together and said, well, the Duterte, basically the Dutertes and the Marcoses coming together. Bongbong Marcos, the son of the former dictator, has come to power. The Marcoses have been rehabilitated. And again, so opposition is very weak. Although I think they were quite inspired during the election. So although small, I think there was a lot of democratic energy during the election. And so I'll come back to this point. I think the role of protest is very, very important as we think about Indonesia's present and future, and making sure that room remains for protest to take place in Indonesia, despite the restriction of space that has taken place in the last few years. But so I think we see here that that I would just make the general point here that democracy has been backsliding, or there's been this authoritarian turn in Southeast Asia for reasons that are not so unlike other parts of the world. That there are some real patterns around the world, and that Indonesia should be kind of looking at and thinking about. So let me kind of, as a way of sort of wrapping up and sort of moving us toward discussion, let me just sort of make 5 sort of general points for discussion. Of course, we can discuss anything you like, but these are things that I think are kind of some broader points to emphasize. One is that what we're seeing around the world is a pattern of the core problem is these sort of strongman leaders. Okay? So people who get elected who do not, I don't want to say they don't have democratic values, right? I don't know if values are the issue, but these are people who simply, whether by their temperament or what have you, they simply will not accept constraints. They will not accept that democracy requires that yes, the majority has to win under democracy. The majority has to rule under democracy, but minorities can't be abused. Opposition has to be respected. Parliament, courts, other institutions that exist to constrain the president, that's a core part of democracy. And we see with these strongman leaders that they simply don't understand that part of democracy, or they don't accept that part of democracy. And this is, again, this is the United States, this is Hungary, this is India, right? This is Turkey, this is Russia, although it's gotten so far beyond in Russia, we're well deeper into the story. But what happens then, I think, so people always ask, well, is polarization the problem? Okay, polarization, because when a country is polarized, people start to think, I have to win, harus menang, tak bisa kalah, right? Polarisasi, right? So if I lose everything. The other side is the enemy. Musuh negara. We're gonna lose everything if the other side wins. And so polarization becomes what gets blamed. But what I would just say is that in work that I've done with Aries Aragai from the Philippines, we talk about the role of these polarizing figures, which are often these strongman leaders. So it's often from these politicians who don't accept constraints that polarization becomes worsened. And so if you've read the excellent new work that Pak Burhan has done on polarization in Indonesia, we can see that at the level of Indonesian society, polarization is not so bad. But among elites, among politicians, they can be unfortunately willing to use polarization, to pit one part of society against another, and to basically attack the pluralist fundamentals of and diverse fundamentals of Indonesian society as a way of trying to gain total power for themselves. And so rather than focusing just on polarization as the problem, I would focus our attention on the actors, on the polarizers, and to think as elections arise, who is a polarizer? Who is likely to use a presidential nomination to polarize rather than to try to become a president for all Indonesians? This is true in America too, true all over. So, but of course I wouldn't say that it's not only the individuals. They need something to polarize. They need some grounding on which to polarize. So they're kind of what's the pattern? And the key here is that as a very general rule, like why does authoritarianism happen? Why do people accept authoritarianism? And I think that the very general broad point here is it comes from people's perceptions of threat. Okay. So it is when people feel that there is some major threat in their society, or maybe from a foreign power, or moral decay, or of crime, or something about perception of threat is what tends to increase people's support for authoritarian measures, authoritarian leaders. And so one should always be alert, be attentive. Whenever political leaders try to make you feel afraid, try to make you feel threatened, emphasize things that threaten you, emphasize things that frighten you, rather than things that maybe unite us, or things that are forms of progress that we're trying to achieve. That this is sort of paving the way for authoritarian retrenchment, for authoritarian attacks on democracy. And so the form that often takes, this is the third point here, again, so it's not that polarizing figures can just work with out of thin air. They usually need some kind of raw material to work with. And here is where I would just make the point that, again, when we look, whether it's India, whether it's Hungary, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Poland, whether it's the United States, what the most natural raw material for these polarizing figures is a majoritarian religious nationalism. Okay? And to be clear, the problem is not religion, and the problem is certainly not any specific religion. The problem arises when a polarizing figure decides to make religion synonymous with the nation, with the people, and treat everyone who is not a member of that religion as a second-class citizen, as not fully national, as not fully human, not fully deserving of human rights, because they aren't part of the political community. So this is a danger everywhere that it doesn't matter if it's Christianity, it doesn't matter if it's Buddhism, it doesn't matter if it's Islam, it doesn't matter what religion it is. It matters that these political figures, these strongman leaders, choose to define the nation in a way and define religion in a way for their own political benefit and rally support on that basis. And so it is this so polarization then becomes the disease, right? It becomes, or sort of becomes the symptom, excuse me. It becomes then sort of the symptom of this deeper disease and these political manipulations. Okay, the fourth point I would note as we think about Indonesia moving forward, so a very broad pattern I've sort of shown in work with Professor Iza Ding in an article called Democratic Decoupling, is that when democracy backslides, when you suffer a democratic regression, it's rarely the case that every aspect of democracy suffers in the same way or at the same time. Okay? And this is actually one thing that's very nice about the VDEM data we were looking at, is they disaggregate. They divide all these different elements of because democracy requires many, many things. It's not just one thing. And so the pattern that Professor Ding and I find is that around the world in recent decades, yes, it is true that democracy is suffering, democracy scores are getting weaker, but it's not primarily elections where the problem is. That actually, if you look certainly back to the 1990s, if you think about the 30 years of the data that I was just showing you, electoral quality around the world continues to improve. The problem is not with elections for the most part, and again, countries can have free and fair elections, but it doesn't mean that people's rights will be protected after those elections take place. Okay? So where we're really seeing, it's not so much a democratic recession as a rights recession. So civil society being cracked down, academics being intimidated, the press being, journalists being killed, or being sued, or being accused of using, fake information and therefore, losing their livelihoods. Students being thrown out of university, having their lives ruined because they stick up for their country or for democracy, and they protest and they get arrested and they get a criminal record. It's these kinds of things. And unfortunately, just because you elect your leaders freely and fairly, it does not protect you from those leaders committing these kinds of abuses. So be on the lookout, right? So be aware that even if it's the case that in Indonesia that, again, we have yet another election with a peaceful transfer of power where it very clearly, reflects the will of the people, where there's not major fraud, which has been the case with Indonesian elections, ever since 1999. That doesn't mean that everything is okay. So thinking about rights, hak asasi manusia, right? Hak minoritas, right? Thinking about these things. These I think are very important to keep in mind. And then the last point I'll make before, hopefully we can have a discussion on anything that interests you, whether on Indonesia or Asia Tenggara or anywhere, is the point I make about protest. So a very big part of the authoritarian turn has been the criminalization of protest and increasing use of repression and increasing use of police and military in very unconstrained ways to act very violently toward protesters, even in democratic settings. Doing things like disrupting social media, shutting off social media, using severe sanctions against people involved in protest, treating every protest as if they're a violent rioter. These are the tactics and techniques that these strongman leaders, these polarizing figures are using. And so it becomes important. And so this is one way in which, protests still matter and are an essential part of democracy, because you simply can't rely on elections alone, and you cannot rely on political elites alone to protect democracy. In Indonesia, as I've written about extensively, there's not strong political opposition among political parties. The tendency is for whoever wins the election in Indonesia to rally all political parties behind them, such that the political parties serve as a very weak constraint. Parliament serves as a very weak constraint on the Indonesian presidency. And I think we've seen with Jokowi has been a much stronger, lebih tegas, right? As a president, he's been much more willing to use his kekuasaan, much more willing to use the substantial formal powers of the Indonesian presidency to govern. And the next president will learn from that and will be, liable to learn the ways that this can be used. And again, once you're elected, elections are not really a constraint. If the next president, fit in with prior practice in Indonesia, if they build a vast coalition, if they basically keep any real parties, major parties from serving in political opposition, then we're going to see a very unconstrained president. And so when elections won't constrain or can't constrain, and when elites won't constrain or can't constrain the leader, protests become really, really vital. And here's where, again, I think Indonesia has, is a real shining example in the world. And here I would say closer to a model in the sense that Pemuda in Indonesia, protesters in Indonesia, civil society in Indonesia historically have always risen to the occasion when democracy was under threat. And so when political elites in Indonesia think they know best, they can pass whatever laws they want, they don't need to consult with society. Indonesian society has always, again, managed to rise to the occasion and push back. And so I would just say that there are really worrisome signs in Indonesia now that it is becoming harder to protest, that the risks of protesting, that the penalties for protesting, the punishments for protesting are becoming greater. And I think that more than anything, I think threatens to strike at the very, very heart of what has made Indonesian democracy function, which is that at the end of the day, maybe if you're a political elite, you want to completely tear down KPK, right? Maybe you want to get rid of direct elections. These might be things you want to do, but there is a cost. Harga tinggi. And this is protest. Right? And if that cost is taken away, if it becomes costly to the protesters instead of costly to the elites to have to face protest, then I worry that this data we see where Indonesia has not regressed as much as India or as much as Turkey or as much as the Philippines, I worry that very, very quickly Indonesia will be in that same category. And that would then, the main cost would be that Indonesia's 275 million people would lose a lot of the very hard-fought freedoms that Indonesians have very bravely, autonomously, independently gained in the last 25 years. And also for those of us around the world who would like to see democracy succeed, who would like to see places become freer, become less violent towards their citizens, to see people have more say in who governs them, that example could be lost as well. And that's why I think the world as we come to G20, hopefully the world will stand with Indonesia, come to learn what Indonesia offers, and really hopefully again, both to understand Indonesian democracy and defend Indonesian democracy, and to do so in a way that is aware of, lebih sadar, more aware of where Indonesia fits in the world, its successes, and also the threats that Indonesian democracy faces. So those are my remarks. So terima kasih atas Pak Burhan, Phillips, Kennedy atas undangan ini, and I look forward to all of your questions and a wider discussion.
Thank you.
Terima kasih Pak Dan untuk presentasinya yang I would not try to summarize, but there are 3 points. 3 poin pentingnya apa yang disampaikan Pak Dan, if I may. Number 1, it's possible to be a democracy without necessarily becoming pro-Western or pro-whatever. So it can be home ground. Kita bisa menjadi demokrasi pada diri sendiri. Itu yang pertama. Yang kedua, ini seperti melihat hutan dan pohon-pohon, forest and the woods, right? If we compare the data from FIDEM and others, it looks like our democracy is greener than other countries, right? Because the data shows. But when we enter the woods, you see the river, lihat sungai-sungainya, lihat jurang-jurangnya, and then lihat buayanya, melihat bekas tambang dan lain-lain. So itu adalah sesuatu yang harus kita perhatikan juga. Yang ketiga, this is very interesting. authoritarian legacy might be contributing to democracy. Seperti di Indonesia. Karena tadi Pak Den bilang bahwa selama masa sebelumnya, masa otoritarian kita sebelumnya, masa Orde Baru, we had relatively strong civilian political parties yang mungkin bisa menjadi roots dari political parties hari ini. Golkar juga beranak pinak menjadi berbagai partai. Yang keempat, tapi ada catatan yang paling penting menurut saya dari sisi political institutional politics adalah bahwa parlemen, DPR, political party hanya punya weak constraining power. Jadi karena segala macam yang disampaikan Pak Den tadi, parlemen dan partai politik itu punya kekuatan untuk menghambat abuse of power itu jadi lebih lemah. Kira-kira demikian yang di 4 poin penting yang menurut saya bisa kita diskusikan. Silakan if there are questions. Ada yang nonton dari YouTube dan dari Zoom, cukup banyak juga yang melihat ini secara live stream. Kalau ada pertanyaan di Zoom silakan di-put di chat box, nanti bisa di-relay ke depan dari teman-teman panitia, dan juga dari YouTube bisa taruh di kolom komen, nanti bisa disampaikan ke depan. Tetapi untuk yang di ruangan ini saya persilahkan, silakan Beltazar, bisa short, crisp, supaya kita banyak ruang untuk diskusi. Ada mikrofon
di tengah ya.
Okay, Mas Philip, allow me to elaborate a tad bit. Pak Dan, thank you for sparking many ideas to each and every one of us. Balthazar from CSIS. You mentioned about polarization as a symptoms. I would like to discuss more about the allergen to the disease, which I think is social media. Because strongmen either disrupt the usage of social media or either capitalize on social media to advance their agenda. I'm borrowing example from Mas Burhan's paper with SET's findings that yield in a strong positive relationship between social media and anti-Chinese resentment, an argument in which narrative mostly driven by strongmen. So the question is going to be in twofold. How influential it is, social media, in becoming the tools for the strongmen to exacerbate or not the upcoming trends of polarization in the 2024 election. And the second one, does social media even reflects the actual condition, or is it just a very loud noise? How valid is the SNA to be the indicator of Indonesian politics, not to be confused with the institution? Thank you.
Thank you, Bels. Ada yang lain? Silakan. Oh ya, by the way, ini bukan cuma forum tanya jawab. We can challenge Dan. Pak Dan, silakan, Okta.
Okay, thank you, Pak Dan, for a very insightful presentations. My name is Okta from CSIS Indonesia. So all of the graphs you shown from FIDEM shows that Indonesia is doing pretty good in terms of electoral democracy compared to many other countries, Muslim countries or East Asian countries. But again, it remains electoral democracy, not not a liberal democracy as we like Indonesia to be, mungkin. But I think implicitly when we say that Indonesia is doing good in terms of electoral democracy, implicitly we said that political parties and an electoral system and party system play a good role actually in maintaining democracy in Indonesia as it is right now. So I want to answer what's your take on the role of party systems, electoral system, in maintaining the quality of democracy from the beginning of our democratization until today. Thank you.
Terima kasih. Mungkin we can start with two.
Sorry.
Oh, ada.
Ada pertanyaan di chat box sekalian mungkin.
Ya,
Satu lagi dari Laurel Heidir. Ini tapi atribusinya belum ada. Laurel Heidir. Oke, nanya mungkin ada data tentang seberapa perubahan perilaku pada birokrasi sipil, kepolisian, dan militer sebagai imbas dari demokratisasi di Indonesia. So that's 3 questions. Maybe, we'll give Professor Dan a chance to answer.
So asking about the role of bureaucracy and role which we've been. Nope. That was not my answer.
Yeah. This is not intimidation.
That's not intimidation. No.
Not intimidation.
I will not break any glasses in response when you. That's right. That's right. That's right. More time to think. More time to think of a good answer because while you clean up. No, that's good. These are great. No. Thank you for these great questions. And yes, like as Philip says, ya silakan mentang. It's like challenge me. Oposisi, suku oposisi. So the first question on polarization as a symptom, and then whether social media is part of the disease. Yeah, and it is true that it's clear that social media is like a steroid. You know, it's like it really can ramp these things up. Social media is part of why we inhabit different worlds. There's a different world between in Indonesia. There's a different world between those who are on social media and those who are not. And in a place like America, where almost everybody is on social media, there's a different world between social media of the political left and social media of the political right. So it does play a role in facilitating this polarization, to be sure. I guess part of why, so I don't want to downplay its influence, but I guess what I would say is that what we should be interested in here is variation, right? Interested in how do you produce a better result, and the way you produce a better result is not by getting rid of social media, right? I mean, social media is going to be that's a fixture, right, of politics in our day and age. What varies, and the reason you get variation in polarization, and you get variation in whether social media is used as a tool to harm or as a tool that's more helpful, the variation is in these leaders, right? And in these polarizing figures. There's not even really that much variation, to be honest, in the raw material that societies have for polarization. Every society has some raw material, to polarize on. So probably the most, homogenous, the closest thing to homogenous countries in the world, right? Japan and South Korea, right? It's as close as you get, And even there, you can get incredible polarization, the assassination of the prime minister in Japan, right? In South Korea, you have polarization by region. All this very, same language, same, all these things same, but you still can get polarization. So there's always, back to the hutan, right? There's always kayu, yang bisa dibakar, But is there an arson or is there not an arson, right? So social media is part of what we, it's part of the infrastructure, of modernity. And so the question is then how do we produce good results? How do we, given social media? But I completely agree. So then the question about using the electoral, I could have also put the liberal democracy indicators as well as electoral. They're not that, again, they're pretty parallel. I think part of the reason I don't is because I think liberal has a certain connotation. I think that, again, in a place like Indonesia, you don't have to be liberal to, constrain the president. If the president says, I'm going to weaken the Anti-Corruption Commission, and the people get out in the street and they prevent it through massive protest and disruption, what was liberal about that? It's not a liberal thing, but the result would be something that VDEM would call the liberal democracy indicator, right? So I think I don't want to create the impression that the way you become more democratic is always about liberalism per se. Indonesia has its own history, its own patterns of tolerance that aren't necessarily grounded in Western liberalism. So I'm glad that Phillips thought that was one of my. I've had 3 important points. That's pretty good. That one of the important points was this, that none of this, to be more democratic does not mean to be more Western. The book I have coming out next month, one of the main points we want to make is, democracy does not have a cardinal direction. There's Eastern democracy, there is Western democracy. Democracy is not, and there's also Western authoritarianism. So, the idea that we should be associating democracy and authoritarianism with directions on the map is a very, I think, a very foolish notion. So, political parties, the role of the bureaucracy, the role of security. So, where do they all fit in this? These are big questions. I would say that. Political parties in Indonesia, I think, have done their minimal job, but not much more than that. Political parties have been willing to accept election results. They have been willing to, Again, I think that the presidential elections has been a bit different about whether you accept the results or not. I think that it's very worrisome. And again, America is a terrible example of this right now, like of the damage it does to a democracy when a presidential candidate or a president simply just refuses to accept that election results are real. I mean, it's a real cancer on democracy. So political parties mostly have not done that here. Political parties have, I think to their credit, they have, approached elections in a peaceful way. And then the negotiations that follow elections in a peaceful and cooperative way. What I think they have not done is been committed to making sure that Indonesian voters always have an opposition option. Because it's just important for democracy that no matter who is in power, that there's someone outside who can serve as an alternative. Because if there's no alternative, then there's very little pressure on the government to perform. And I think a lot of the governance problems in Indonesia have been, so despite having a pretty robust democracy, not having a very robust political opposition. So I think that's one fundamental role of political parties that parties in Indonesia have mostly not played. But again, that also means you're acting in a way that's not so polarizing. So compare that. So would you rather have parties, kind of collude to share power and build a cartel, or would you rather have them trying to, to kill each other or demonize each other, right? So not that we have to set that up as the standard, but I think that that's certainly part of the story with political parties. I think that with the bureaucracy and the security services, again, here's where I think the authoritarian legacies are more negative, although I'd say mixed. On the one hand, Indonesia has pretty impressive state capacity. Indonesia is actually, I think we saw, during the pandemic, of course, I mean, everywhere struggled terribly with the pandemic. I don't think anyone really responded well to the pandemic. But we see with the economy now, we see again social stability. I mean, Indonesia is a relatively, closely governed place, and the bureaucracy was, kind of built up during the new order, and that is served as the kind of the steel frame, as we often say, right, for politics. And so unlike, say, the Philippines with a much weaker state, for instance. So it plays a supportive role. But I do think that the oversized role of the military, the oversized role of the police, and now the growing role of the police in politics in recent years. And I think this is a little bit of bespeaks a weakness of or a failure of political parties, which is, political parties, I think, too often will rely on the military when they are divided, or they'll try to rely on the military for support rather than handling things themselves, which gives the military a very big role. And again, I think there's political militarization, I think, is a very general problem that it's not reducible to democracy or authoritarianism. So the United States is, again, has long been a democracy, but it has a problem of the military. I mean, just the size of, the role of, the budgets of the military is so enormous. And I think that's, that creates certain problems in the United States. So it's not only in countries that have a history of authoritarianism that have this problem. But I would say that the size of the security services, the kind of direct governance role, and in the economy as well, that security agencies play in Indonesia, is both a drag on democratic quality and also kind of a permanent threat. Because again, I think that Indonesia has to look at what's happened in Thailand and Myanmar and really be waspada, be alert to the fact that a military with that kind of power and those kinds of resources can always, intervene, and it doesn't need a good reason to. They haven't had good reasons in Thailand and Myanmar, and yet they've done it, and they've been able to get away with it.
Thank you. Then I think we still have time for the second round of question. There is one that is related to me. Before I open the floor again, bagaimana pandangan Pak Dan atas transactional politics, money politics, oligarchic politics, and so on, dan bagaimana itu berhubungan dengan matinya civil society, the weakening of civil society. Itu pertanyaan satu, saya tidak dapat namanya. Silahkan yang lain di ini, Pak Burhan, kemudian Pak Jayadi, dan Pak Umam. Siap. Pak Burhan, silakan.
Oke, ini ya. Thank you very much, Dan, for your interesting presentation. So my question is about why Indonesian democracy is relatively good compared to many other countries in the world. You mentioned military factors, the Indonesian military more democratic compared to Myanmar or Thailand. You also mentioned civil society. And in the interview with Democracy Paradox, you mentioned Indonesian voters who, often defend Indonesian democracy. They show up and reject, the most anti-pluralistic candidate, especially 2014 and 2019. But, kadang saya bingung when we discuss about Indonesian voters. My research with Ed Aspinall, Diego Fossati, and Eve Warburton found that in many occasions, Indonesian voters more illiberal than Indonesian elite. They are, they have illiberal views in many ways. They are not liberal democrat, of course, but, kalau kita bandingkan dengan Filipina, pemilih kita masih lebih baik. Nggak mungkin itu ya. Orang kayak Bongbong itu menang di Indonesia. Bongbong Marcos menang sebagai pemilu di Filipina, tapi di Indonesia, I don't think they will vote for Tommy Soeharto, for example. They still have, it's like ideal type of leaders, democratic leaders, but on the other hand, they have illiberal views. So basically, what the main factors why Indonesian democracy still survive, and not only survive, they perform better than other countries in the world?
Ya, Pak Jayadi, silakan. Thank you, Pak Dan. Teman saya di samping bilang namanya Dan. Dan itu jadi penyambung. So you are the bridge, the connector. Yeah, maybe because he likes your big statement about Indonesian democracy. Yeah, that's a very bold statement. Very important. Indonesian democracy is very important, right? In the world, that is very bold statement from Dan. Actually, I have 5 reactions or questions, but I will just mention 2. Number 1 is a bit related to Pak Burhan in a way, but I might have misheard you or misinterpreted your presentation. The reason the military is not seizing power in Indonesia so far is ironically because they have been always close to power. That is my impressions of your statement. In other words, they have never been really sidelined, so they don't feel the need to directly take the power, right? Now, isn't that irony from a democratic point of view, right? Let's say, whether or not this is American democracy, there is a doctrine of civilian supremacy, correct? How is it? That means if that civilian supremacy theory we will be using, that means Indonesian democracy will never be really democratic in terms of the relationship between the military and power. So could you elaborate more on that? I may have misinterpreted what you have been saying. Number 2, although you do not mention you did not mention it literally, but I know you have been researching party cartelization for quite a while, right? On the one hand, so my question is that to what extent that these cartelizations of political parties, and you mentioned again about that, with the fact that there is no strong opposition, right? Political parties are all willing to be always together, anything goes, right? Except for SBY and PKS, right? For the reason, not because they don't want to be opposition, maybe because of other reason, right? Pengecualian, and they are only 18% after all. So my question is, to what extent this cartelization will erode will put Indonesian democracy into danger. One, and when we connect that or relate that to Indonesian governmental system, we have a presidential democracy, where, as you know, in presidential democracy there is a tendency, the so-called majoritarian tendency, right? So where the president is trying to exercise his majoritarian tendency, and he is surrounded by political parties that are willing to be always part of him, then will that be a danger to Indonesian democracy? Now, I think I have very short question. Those are the questions, but this is rather maybe a naughty question, maybe? About polarizing strongman figure. Does it exist in Indonesia? And who?
Indonesian version of Trump.
Oke, silakan Pak Khairul.
Terima kasih Mas Philip. Thank you Professor Dan. Currently, I'm still doing kind of research focusing on narratives related to the democratic regression in Indonesia. And we already try to identify there are several topics or narrative themes related to the democratic regression. One of them related to the rising polarization, as you previously mentioned, and then weakening anti-corruption agencies, weakening civil liberties, and then centralization and abuse of power, and then the last but not least, rising military role in the public offices. Related to the last point, I think that will be quite interesting because I think that we suffer, or there is a lack of civil supremacy. To some extent, we're very happy when the civil president come to the power, but at the same time, I don't know, maybe they feel not really confident enough, and then in the same time, they open space for the military role getting stronger and stronger. And then in the same time, we also identified there are several political dynamics related to the weakening corruption commission agency, I mean the KPK, and then law on omnibus law, I mean, and then the current controversial related to the KUHP. And the main narrative that has been used by those who try to impose this, I don't know, it's kind of authoritarian narratives, is stability and certainty. Stability related to the, of course, social cohesion in the one side. On the other side, talking about stability and certainty for economic development. So this situation reminds us to the previous debate in many, many years ago related to the state institutionalization coined by Huntington and so on. And in this case, my question is, I think actually you already mentioned it, but your answer is quite clear, but I'm trying to make sure. Because to some extent, some people try to associate the authoritarian trend is closely related to the global forces tension. Sorry, maybe this is kind of, what's that, how to say, apa kalau, ya agak mengawang-awang gitu ya. But related to the Undang-Undang Cipta Kerja, and then point to have stability and certainty, that's mostly related to the investment invitation issue. And by conducting several approach, and then this political operation quite closely related to the, how to say, global investors. So that's why a couple of weeks ago, I already met acquaintance in one of the friend's wedding in HI. Some people say that what happened in Australia, the winning of the Albanese power, that's also influenced by the power of Chinese, because Australia is trying to get a more stable relation with Beijing. In the same time, what has been mentioned by Mas Burhan, I met someone, US, they also proudly claim that what happened in Philippines, so the win of Marcos Jr., also supported by the US for the sake of the interest against China. So in this case, I would like to make sure whether do you think the global major forces definitely, what to say, a gift or the big influence within the major political dynamics within the country, especially in this region in Southeast Asia. That's it, my question. Maybe if you could provide us several examples related to the other countries in this region, this would be great. If no, I think this will be clear comparing with the previous answer. Thank you. Done.
All right, we have three questions. I think that, but if I may, Pak Burhan bertanya bagaimana menjelaskan apa yang disampaikan Pak Den tadi. Menurut penelitian Pak Burhan adalah di Indonesia ada keunikan, we have illiberal voters with democratic preference. Mereka illiberal tapi mereka cuma punya tipe ideal tentang demokrasi juga. That's why kita tidak go further seperti negara-negara lain yang demokrasinya kualitasnya menurun. Nomor dua, Pak Jayadi ada 3 thing. Puzzle, kalau Indonesian military itu that has never been fully disenfranchised from power. Menurut Pak Den itu bagus. Tapi from democratic point of view, itu something yang mungkin bisa is questionable. Nomor dua, how long until party catalyzation really erode the Indonesian democracy? Nomor tiga, example of polarizing figure. Khairul Umam, number 1, civic space is shrinking. Bagaimana itu mempengaruhi demokrasi? Yang kedua, faktor eksternal, international political economy or whatnot, tentang bagaimana investors dan lain-lain yang menyebabkan kita harus prefer stability dan seterusnya.
Banyak. Where to begin? So, I guess maybe start with this. So I didn't mean to say that it's bagus if the military is not disenfranchised. This might come back to Jay's question. So I think that the point I would make is how democratic a place is and how much of a role the military plays are not exactly the same thing. So you could look at a place like China, right? The military is very politically subservient, but it's obviously a very authoritarian place. Right? So whether or not you control the military is a little bit of a separate question from how democratic. And so my point was that the fact that the big point in Indonesia is that civilian political parties have been sort of strong enough and kind of competent enough, like able to govern enough, working with the bureaucracy, enough that the military hasn't felt that need for purposes of stability. Back to the stability question, to intervene. Now, if there is a stability excuse, that makes it easier for the military to intervene. Again, Myanmar shows you don't need, they just claim the elections were stolen, and so they'll say anything they want. So it's a little bit of the story that that Ed Aspinall has always said about the irony of success, right? That the reason Indonesian democracy survives is because of low quality. I think that is. I think that there is some truth to that, but I also think that, and this is to the cartelization point, I also think low quality democracy is always in danger because the people don't have reason to defend it. And so I'm certainly not of the view that in some straightforward way, the lower Indonesian democratic quality, the more stable, the more or just not even the better, but the more survivable. That I do not believe that is true. People need something to defend, otherwise, you can think back to, I always think about, 2000 when in Pakistan and Musharraf does this coup against the government in Pakistan, and absolutely nobody cared, because it was such a mess, and democracy was just completely non-functional, and the two political parties were so corrupt, and so that's a perfect example of when democratic quality is really low, democracy is in very real danger. So the issue with cartelization was, and what my worry has always been, is it would push down the quality of democracy so low that the Indonesian people would have no particular reason to fight for it. And this is, I think, was, when I first started writing about this in 2004, was a very, very real possibility. I still believe that if direct presidential elections hadn't been introduced, that the party cartel would have remained completely in place, and I actually really doubt that Indonesian democracy would have survived. Because you could see very, very quickly, like, who would have been, in 2004, you would have had, Bu Mega against Akbar, right? What kind of turnout would you have in that election? The fact that direct presidential elections opened, it cracked open a window, and Indonesian voters have done a very, very good job of using that window and of finding, again, politicians who actually do, seemingly really care about them, right? I think the thing about Jokowi is he does actually get out in the streets. He actually gets out with the voters. He merakyat, right? This is the essence of. It's not about liberal, it's about being merakyat. And most Indonesian politicians, like most politicians everywhere, are not very merakyat. So if you are merakyat, it makes a big difference. And people notice, and they can tell the difference. And they tend to support candidates who are. And so I would say that, again, to me, cartelization has always been a big worry. And the worry has always been that it would get to a certain point that it would kind of say, well, then what's the point? You literally cannot remove anybody. You can't, your vote really means absolutely nothing. And it's been close to that at times, but it's never gotten quite that bad. But I do think, I'm quite worried about it in 2024. I think that the big difference with Jokowi is we've seen that, again, under Bu Mega, under SBY, I mean, the idea was the parties were able to kind of control the president, right? That president shared power, and that made the president weak. And what Jokowi has learned, I think partly because he's been an executive, or he's been a mayor, he's been a governor, unlike SBY and Bu Mega had never run anything like that before. Right? Certainly hadn't been executive. He realizes that you share power to gain power. You share power in a way that makes sure none of your, quote unquote partners are too strong, too influential. Yeah, and so he actually is using the power. I mean, all of these powers were there for SBA to use too, but he simply didn't. And so my concern is now, whereas in the past you might say, well, a president might think they need to exclude certain parties so they have a free hand. This is what's happened in, like in Latin America to a large degree. So a president wants to rule in a strong way, they try to rule alone. Well, Jokowi has proven, no, if you want to rule in a really strong way, you rule together. And he's, in that way, reflecting what Duterte has done in the Philippines. He doesn't rule, he didn't rule alone, he ruled together. He had the whole political elite behind him, essentially, right? And so my concern is whoever wins in 2024 will be able to learn from this and be able to say that everybody join up, everybody comes in, and let's basically make sure there's no real opposition to anything that we want to do. And at that point, you really can go after KPK. You really can go after direct elections. You really can go after, whichever civil society groups are giving you a hard time. You really, really then have a free hand. And so I think the fact that the problem of cartelization has not, meant the death of Indonesian democracy yet doesn't mean that it can't be. And that's one reason I've tried to keep my eyes on that, for so long. On the external role, I think, I don't think we're at a point where these external actors are decisive, I would say. I think that, during the Cold War, of course, both the Americans and the Soviet Union had a very strong interest in certain, regime types and certain leaders being in power. And then that kind of influence and that kind of, interventionism declined after the Cold War ended. And so now with the U.S.-China rivalry, there's, I think, a danger that it will pick up again. And again, I think it's something to watch for. I don't think that we're there. I don't think we're there yet. I think China actually has not very strong regime preferences, to be honest. I think that, so in a case like Myanmar, right, they worked closely with the military, and then when Aung San Suu Kyi won elections, they worked closely with her, and China will work with whoever they can work with, So I don't think that there's a particular actor trying to create authoritarianism other than, Putin, Russia, which I think is more interested, not so much in building up authoritarian regimes, but more just weakening those countries that will try to, give them a hard time, and now that oppose Putin's war in Ukraine. Which else of these? So this paradox of illiberal voters and liberal outcomes. I think a lot of it is luck, to be honest. It was true that the question of which voters they pick. Yeah. Oh, to believe in luck? Well, maybe the batik is having that effect. It's making me right. I think voters don't. It's often said voters like a country the voters get the democracy they deserve. I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that's true at all. I think that the people who you get to choose from, it's like saying you get to choose what you eat at a restaurant, right? You don't know what's on the menu. You don't decide what's on the menu. The people who own the restaurant decides what's on the menu. You have to choose from, so you go to a restaurant and there's, and there's only two, dua pilihan aja, right? And so it's been fortunate, I think, in Indonesia that certain, politicians have emerged who, at least were willing to be pretty constrained. So SBA certainly was willing to be constrained, during a time period when, Indonesian democracy was still young and fragile. I think, I think, Bu Mega did not know how to use the power of the presidency, but again, that in some ways, it let Parliament become stronger. That wasn't all bad for, democracy to gain its roots. And so, thankfully, there have been some options who have not been just purely kind of, unconstrained, strongman kinds of leaders. And then in the last two elections, and this is back to Jay's question about, like, is there a polarizing figure in Indonesia? They have not chosen the more polarizing figure. I would say in 2014 and in 2019, by my definition, there has certainly been a polarizing figure. That Prabowo Subianto has absolutely served in that role in the last two elections. And the question now, so now he obviously made peace with Jokowi. He's acting as a statesman. He's acting as a unifier. He's kind of trying to, project a new image. And it will be, it's not up to an American to come and say, well, what do we think of Prabowo? It'll be up to Indonesia's voters to decide whether they believe in this transformation or not. And, again, Brown's right. Well, yeah, Tommy Suharto wouldn't get support, but Prabowo played a quite central role in the New Order. He was profoundly discredited after the New Order, but has come back. He's managed to launder his image that the past the New Order has been able. It hasn't prevented him from first teaming up with running to try to run Golkar, and then teaming up with Mega, and then becoming a legitimate actor. He's next to Surya Paloh in every commercial on TV. He's taking selfies with Jokowi. All of these things, right? So I think, again, waspada, right? Your job in Indonesian voters is to be waspada. And again, there's a track record, and I think the track record, not just of being a polarizing figure, but being of one who, again, like Trump, who just will bald-faced lie about, elections being stolen and fake. These are very, very worrisome. To me, these can be seen as sort of disqualifying behaviors. And so it'll be up to Indonesian voters to decide how much to forgive or how much to look past that. I don't know what will conclude, but I would certainly say, there are a lot of talented politicians in Indonesia. Like, why take the risk? I think there are enough Indonesian politicians who you can say with confidence that they're not, kind of on a mission to, establish one-man rule, right? So why would you ever, why would you take the risk if that's something that you're concerned about? Right, so I guess that doesn't totally answer the illiberalism question, though. I think, so partly it's been that just candidates have emerged, and they vote for those candidates not because of liberalism alone, but because of their effectiveness, because of what they can bring in terms of development. But I do think, Indonesia does have this historical, PDIP-NU coalition, right? This is very, very deep roots. And certainly in 2019, it was, a very old story of aliran and cleavages. That the combination of, Javanese nationalist, Sukarnoist, pro-Pancasila politician, and they team up with, a respected figure from NU, that this is a real electoral juggernaut, and that proved, enough to win in 2019. Basically the election, the difference between 2014 and 2019, the way I read the data was basically how well Pak Jokowi did in, Central and East Java. That was just a huge, huge part of it. And that was about his vice presidential selection. That was a big part of it. And so that's something that, whether we talk about, we don't have to call it liberalism, but I think there's a pluralism, right? I think that the everyday experience of most Indonesians, as I understand it, is basically one of pluralism. Most Indonesians live day in, day out in a pluralistic setting. And it's a pretty natural thing that you don't have to be a Muslim to be an Indonesian, right? You don't have to be a certain kind of Muslim to be an Indonesian. Just the fact that even NU Muhammadiyah, people, you're raised knowing that very different kinds of Muslims than you are just as Indonesian as you, right? So this didn't become an election between, Muslims and Christians. Of course, non-Muslims voted overwhelmingly for Jokowi, right? But Jokowi received enormous support from Muslims. You can't win an Indonesian election without enormous support from Muslims. It's impossible, right? It's just mathematics, right? So I guess I wouldn't say that, I don't know that I would call it liberal. I think Jeremy Menchik's work on, tolerance without liberalism, I find pretty compelling. I think it doesn't have to be liberal in a way that other societies define liberalism, but I do think there is a kind of acceptance of, or a recognition of, or an awareness of, or a socialization to the basic fact of, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, right? That I do think means when you combine that with a candidate who is seen as merakyat and who will be good for development, that can still be a winning combination, And so, but the fact that the surveys, these wonderful surveys that you guys do show there's this illiberal potential means, again, that's the kayu in the hutan. This is the wood that a politician can burn when they want to do so and try to win on a more illiberal basis. We've seen in America, most Americans, I think, certainly, I never believed that someone could come along in a kind of very illiberal way and try to set that fire and, win power in a very intolerant, white Christian nationalist kind of way. And thanks to rules that mean you don't have to win a majority in America to win the presidency, he was able to win. But yeah, everywhere has this potential. And I would just say Indonesia has some very deep historical, social resources and cultural resources at least for pluralism, which it has drawn upon, in the last 2 elections for sure. And again, the longer Indonesian democracy survives, the better its chances, I think, because I think it becomes harder to reverse. I think that, like all of the kind of the push for like a 3rd term for Jokowi, for instance, right? I think there was more pushback against it today than there would have been, 15 years ago, maybe, right? Again, people have become acclimated. They've become, accustomed to the idea that, no, that's not what you do, And so I do think, I would be wary of understating the pluralist foundations of Indonesian society. And certainly the pluralist potential, but also, again, it's illiberal, the dangers that every society has. And it's, again, specifically, it's precisely when someone says, this religion is the nation's religion, these people are the nation's real people, and others simply don't, So as, Michael Mann put it, like, the demos becomes the ethnos. The people become one group in the country and not the whole country. That's a permanent danger. I've got this chapter in a new book on Indonesia where I call it the politics of permanent pitfalls. Okay? So the idea is, what democracy is it's permanent pitfalls. Every election, every time, every decision, there's always the possibility of things going the wrong way. This is what we've really learned the last decade or so. We used to talk about democratic consolidation, like, oh, okay, you've had 2 peaceful transfers, nothing bad can happen anymore. You know, you're immortal. We all know how untrue that is, and so Indonesia has to follow this politics of permanent pitfalls, just like America does, just like other places do. And so the key is to know what those pitfalls are and to think about how do you build a coalition to allow you to avoid those pitfalls, you know. And that means knowing history, it means drawing selectively from other places, you know, drawing lessons, looking at other examples. But no country is going to be a model for another country. Indonesia will be Indonesia. So.
All right, yeah.
Ini saya dapat message dari di belakang.
Ada pertanyaan?
Ada yang mau interaktif ya, boleh satu aja.
Asal short ya?
Iya ya. Mungkin Adit itu Mas Sindu Andre ya dari Denpasar, Bali, GMNI.
Alright. Yes, silakan Mas siapa? Andre.
Sindu Andre.
Sindo Andre dari Bali. Mungkin Andre namanya dari koran Sindo di Bali. Di Zoom ada nggak? Oke. Sambil nunggu Pak Sindo Andre, ini ada juga tadi yang tanya ke saya, di relay ke saya. Could you comment on the democratic culture within political parties? Because that's where it starts. No democratic culture, no regular election within the party. Alright, Pak Sindo Andre, silakan very brief.
Okay, terima kasih. It's very short question, actually. But first of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Sindu Andre. I'm from National Indonesian Movement. Yeah. From the academia also. It's very insightful forum, and I would like to deliver my direct question to the distinguished speaker from this very valuable forum. And I think during the conversation, during the discussion, I've heard about the cartelization, if I'm not mistaken. In your opinion, Professor Dan, maybe you can explain more about what is the truly root of cause of this cartelization, because I've read about political cleavage, according to Clifford Geertz, Indonesianist. I think that's the cause of this cartelization, or even in fact the political dynasty that currently occur in our basic political system or socio-political structure in Indonesia. And I think in your very opinion, what's your explanation regarding that issues, because of the sense of democracy is getting far or getting farther from this truest meaning. Even in fact, the United States or the leading democracy country in the global north doesn't looks like really, like become a pioneering, become a statue of that democracy also. Even in fact, they are divided, they are keep talking about budgeting, and even in fact the rest of the region also kind of a tug of war among other parties side. I think do you share the same opinion like that, or you have a strong or robust or maybe invigorated, maybe perhaps in the sense of the truest meaning of the democracy? Thank you very much for this occasion. I hope that question will.
Dari GMNI
Yes,
Bali.
thank you very much for this work. Yeah.
Silakan Pak Dan.
Okay, terima kasih. So I love this question about the causes of cartelization. It's something I've thought a lot about, and it's something I've really struggled with, because usually, so I do comparative politics, and so the way you usually do, at least I do comparative politics, is it's hard to figure out what's happening in one country unless you have something to compare it to. And then what that allows you to do is sort of, eliminate certain explanations, right? So if Indonesia is similar in this way, but it winds up different, then you have to look for the difference. The problem is Indonesia is so unusual in this way, right? And other countries that kind of went through somewhat similar transitions, like wound up really, really not with this kind of cartelized situation. So I do think that the root cause is something about Indonesia and the way that power works in Indonesia. I tend to think about things historically, So the way I would think about it is not so much as a culture, but as about a set of historical, kind of happenings and of stages. So I think that there was something about, what it took to win independence. That even just to win, Merdeka required a certain kind of cooperation, required a certain kind of setting aside, these differences were real between different communities, different aliran, but you had to set them aside to win. You needed a broad, vast, united front. So there was kind of a, back in the Sukarno days, there's a language for that. I think that, but I don't think that's sufficient because, during the parliamentary democracy period, you didn't have these kind of, cartel arrangements. It was very, very divided. So then that would suggest it's something about, from guided democracy then to the New Order period, about, again, trying to, co-opt and trying to bring a lot of different groups into power and not, So, and then I think that certain networks of elites emerged as well during the, during the New Order. So during the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was just a level of, comfort and familiarity that people had with each other. There were the Chiganjur meetings that SBA helped organize that kind of brought together, like, let's push for elections, and that included, Gus Dur, and it included, Bumega, and it included Amin Rais, and these kinds of things. And so there was a historical process through which cooperation was how democracy came about. And I think that definitely gave it some legs as well. But then ultimately the institutions matter. The political rules matter. I think that if, from the beginning, if Indonesia didn't have this unusual system of, having MPR choose the president, right? That provided a kind of occasion for and a way in which parties could sort of insist upon a sort of cartelized arrangement. So if you had just had direct presidential elections in 1999, I don't know that it happens. Okay, so it's sort of like, like anything that's caused in the world. Like, think about your own life. Like, how did you wind up where you are? You could tell the story like, well, there was this. If this had gone differently, I'd be somewhere else. I wouldn't have met this person. I wouldn't have gone to that school. So it's this thin path that a life is, and in a way, it's sort of like that. That there is all these different ways that the kind of way that power gets exercised in Indonesia had to go through these, jump these hurdles or run this gauntlet, of ways that it might not have happened, but that it did. And I think all of those things matter. So I would think about it historically. I would think about it as both a source of, potential strength and weakness, but just a sort of uniqueness, distinctiveness of what Indonesia is, that this is how power tends to be used. I mean, this ability, or if you want to call it an ability, of politicians to compete and compete and compete in elections, and then it just stops. As soon as the election is over, that either is an ability that politicians lack elsewhere, or it is, something that it's quite remarkable, I think. So it's something that's obviously fascinated me for a long time, and I think that again, the real virtue of it is I think it does provide an important tool for combating polarization, particularly a kind of polarization that tears a country apart, that leads to violence, that leads to the collapse of democracy. And it's led in Indonesia to today. What we have is, it's been argued that there's an authoritarian dimension to this too, but to basically use the banning of PEI, the banning of HTI, to use these tools in defense of pluralism and in defense of minorities makes Indonesia look very different from places that have had more serious democratic backsliding, where it really has been empowered, emboldened majorities, kind of punishing minorities for their lack of national status that have produce these outcomes. So Indonesia is not as far along on the same path as some of these places. In some ways right now, Indonesia is looking very different. And that gives me, again, some hope and some optimism that it can avoid going further down the path of an India, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, and we'll see about the United States next time I'm back, which direction the United States goes.
All right. I think we are almost reached the end of the session, I think. But if I may, as a moderator, I'm going to use my power to ask questions. Speaking about Southeast Asia, 25 years ago when Indonesia started democratization, and then the following years, Southeast Asia was hailed as dynamic, open, then poised to be a democratic region. But now here we are, we have two junta, military junta in the region, in the Philippines, in Thailand and Myanmar. And also, some said that there will be a serious democratic regression in the Philippines and Malaysia. In the past 3 years, they changed government 3 times, 4 times. You know, very unstable situation. So, what would be? I haven't heard from you. What would be the political explanation, political economy explanation of this? Because what happened in Thailand or in the Philippines, it happened when economy is doing relatively well, you know. In the sense, Indonesia as well. Some said in the room, around the table, and also from Zoom, that Timor-Leste as well, right? And then we are doing economically, right? So it goes back to the, it goes back to the old question of democracy versus development, or value about the versus economy and so on. What would you take on that?
Your new book. That's right. Well, buy the book. Everyone will, or borrow from Perpustakaan. You don't have to buy it. Well, I think that this is a great question. It's a big topic. I guess I would say that exactly what you said about Thailand. I mean, you know, democracy can die when things are good. It can die when things are bad. There's one of my favorite essays about democracy was written by Charles Tilly. It's called "Democracy is a Lake." And so what he meant by that was, democracy is a lake. What he meant is that, well, lakes can form in all kinds of ways. You know, they can form from rivers. They can form from the melting of glaciers. But once it's a lake, it's a lake. But it can happen in all kinds of ways. There's not only one way to cause a lake. And in the same way, there's not only one way to create a democracy, and there's also not only one way to kill a democracy, right? So you say, why do people die? You say, well, they die for all kinds of reasons. And so it's possible that there's not only one story. There's not just one story that can explain why Southeast Asia went from being, again, having this kind of promise of the late 90s to seeming a very unpromising region today. But I think the region itself is a little bit of an artificial construct. I don't know that when things go wrong in the Philippines that somehow this reflects on Indonesia because it's also part of Southeast Asia. I think each of these countries, each of these democracies or regimes, they're each their own lake, and they form and they have their problems in their own ways. But I would also just stress, it's not only if it were only Southeast Asia, that'd be one kind of story. It's clearly a global story. So we go back to the gentleman's point about social media, right? So this is something where that's clearly been picked up on and being used in lots of polarizing and non-democratic ways. I think we see, urban-rural, polarization around the world and divides. There's some of these things, there are these kind of global patterns. So what I would encourage is think about, every country is nested within a regional context. It's nested within a historical context. And it's going to be some sort of combination of those factors that give us the best understanding and the best explanation for what we're looking for. But I think the main move that you just made is really the important one, is just to say, go back to the 90s, think about what we thought then, how different things are from what we thought then, and you kind of really realize that what Indonesia's accomplished is remarkable, and therefore, it's not worth defending because it's perfect. It's worth defending in part because because it has these problems, and therefore it's all the more reason that it needs people who believe in it and want to see it continue to fight for it.
Thank you. Please give a round of applause to Prof. Dan. Terima kasih buat teman-teman yang sudah ikut dari Zoom maupun dari YouTube. Kenapa? Sebagai reminder, menurut saya tadi yang sampaikan Pak Den pentingnya. Jangan sampai kita hanya mempunyai low quality demokrasi karena nanti kita tidak punya reason untuk mendefend. Jadi tidak boleh mediocre. But as we speak, a few days ago, military junta in Myanmar killed, executed democracy activists. That's how serious the problem is, I think that civil liberty is in danger. Kalau kita tolerate having a low quality of democracy, that kind of thing would spread. So kita coba mempertahankan demokrasi. Terima kasih Pak Den. Semoga tulisannya di Journal of Democracy will be published. Oh ya, Pak Den mau langsung buku, dan juga saya tadi lupa menyampaikan bahwa Pak Den Slater ini adalah Professor of Political Science di Department of Political Science University of Michigan, juga Direktur dari Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. Jadi sudah pasti. Hah? Muridnya siapa? Oh, murid-muridnya Niko. Kemarin udah ketemu Niko, baru selesai apa tuh namanya?
Saya murid dia.
Dia lagi baru selesai isolasi ya, isoman. Oke. Terima kasih, kita tutup dulu ya. Thank you Pak Den.
Oke, terima kasih untuk
Pak.
semua teman-teman yang udah bergabung. Kita tutup acara diskusi hari ini, sampai jumpa di lain kesempatan.
Bukan dengan basmalah, dengan hamdalah. Oh, hamdalah. Ayo kita makan bersama. Oh iya. Oh iya. Foto-foto Indonesia banget lagi.